Hi everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes and let the last few people join us before we start the webinar. So we've just hit 1 o'clock according to my clock here, so we'll get started. And before we kick off the webinar, just a few ground rules from my perspective in terms of any questions you guys have as we're going through. We do have a pretty big audience on today, but I do like to keep this interactive. So any single bullet point I'm on or topic that I'm discussing, feel free to type out a question in the question box and I'll answer them on the fly as we go through. Nothing's too scary or too big a subject to tackle. We'll take on anything and everything. So in this webinar, we're going to cover Zerto's cost effectiveness and how we deliver simple and consistent disaster recovery for your virtualized environments. And just as an introduction about myself, my name is Joshua Stenhouse and I'm a technical evangelist at Zerto. But before I worked for Zerto, I was actually an end user. And so my experience that I'll talk about today is from managing my own virtualized infrastructure, having problems around BCDR, and what I found resolved my problems was, in fact, Zerto itself. So I bought, installed, and used Zerto myself, and so everything I'll talk about in this webinar is from the perspective of me using it as a customer and then me selling it now working for Zerto. Apologies if there's a little bit of background noise at the start here. So in terms of the agenda, we'll go through an introduction of Zerto. We'll talk about how we protect the applications and the architecture overview. We'll talk about the Zerto solution and the feature benefits. We'll look at the case studies that we have available, and then we'll go into a demonstration of the product. Just as a general introduction, Zerto provides enterprise-class virtual replication BCDR solutions for private, hybrid, and now public clouds. And at Zerto, we revolutionized BCDR because we saw that the replication was being done at the wrong layer. Just bear with me 1 second. I believe I might have an issue with the resolution. I'm just checking my audience view. Yes, I believe I do. 1 second. I'm just going to switch the screen. That's better. Sorry if anyone had problems seeing the full presentation. It should be all correct now. I just switched the screens that I was showing it on. So back to the presentation. At Zerto, we revolutionized BCDR in virtualized environments. And we did this because we saw that the traditional way of doing enterprise-class BCDR was the storage-based replication, where you had to match the storage arrays between the sites. They had to be the exact same make and model, and you configured all of the replication on a storage and run basis. And this made sense in a physical environment because it was pretty much the only way to get any enterprise-class BCDR. But as soon as you introduced virtualization and everything was done on a per VM level, it no longer made sense to do everything on a storage and run basis. And we saw that this replication was in the wrong place because it didn't match what you were doing in the hypervisor. It was slow to respond, and it certainly wasn't software defined. And all you've seen over the last few years and more recently is a trend for everything to do with virtualization becoming software defined, such as the networking, your firewalls, your load balancers. And Zerto has essentially done the same thing for your enterprise class BCDR. And what we've done is we've removed the lock-in at the storage layer by moving the replication into the hypervisor. And we revolutionized the BCDR by delivering the world's first enterprise class software-defined replication and recovery automation solution. And it's the reason why Zerto has been growing exponentially ever since, with over 1,000 enterprise customers worldwide protecting over 100,000 virtual machines. We have 200 Zerto cloud service providers that use the Zerto software for replication in their cloud and the ability for you to replicate to one of these cloud service providers. And we have over 600 worldwide channel partners, all trained and selling the Zerto software solution today. The reason why it's grown so much is because Zerto is completely virtual aware in that we're integrated into the virtual environment. So everything in a Zerto world is done by just selecting the virtual machines that you want to protect. And the virtual awareness simply means that it's simple because you're just selecting virtual machines. It doesn't matter about the underlying storage that they're configured on. It's enterprise class in that we will never impact the performance of the protected virtual machines, and we deliver all the enterprise class functionality required in a BCDR solution. It's completely software only, so there's no complex storage-based replication to configure. All of the replication is managed using software in the hypervisor. And starting Zerto 4.0, which is due out imminently, we'll not only be storage agnostic, we'll also be hypervisor agnostic too. And what this means is that with Zerto 4.0, with one strategic software solution, for your private cloud, you can protect virtual machines between any storage and your different VMware data centers. In 4.0, you can also now use Zerto to protect between Microsoft Hyper-V data centers. And even more exciting is the prospect of cross-hypervisor replication and conversion, where we will allow you to replicate virtual machines from VMware vSphere into Microsoft Hyper-V, allowing you to utilize your Hyper-V licenses in ways that simply were not possible before. And I know this sounds quite outrageous in the fact that you can replicate from one hypervisor to another and just have the ability to fail over in seconds, but believe me, it works. What we'll actually do later in the webinar is switch across to my demo lab where I can show you this running real time. One great use case here is if, for example, you have existing Microsoft Hyper-V licensing and you want to find some way of using it, you can carry on using VMware in production, utilize Hyper-V in your DR site, and reduce your licensing cost for your hypervisor. We support replicating from multiple satellite offices over any distance, so you can have replication from multiple VMware or Hyper-V data centers into a centralized VMware data center, for example. You can use Zerto to replicate to our Zerto cloud service providers, of which we have over 200 that I mentioned, and this removes the need for you having to manage the cost center of having a DR site altogether, and it gives you a managed service where you can call somebody to actually initiate a failover for you. And we have hybrid cloud providers who also use Zerto for intra-cloud, so you can move your VMs to a cloud provider, and then they will actually use Zerto to protect the virtual machines inside their data centers. Or we have some customers who move the virtual machines to a cloud provider and then do reverse DR as a service to ensure that they always have a copy of their data if and when required, so they can actually move out of the cloud provider if they wanted to change their target. And we also now have support for replication directly into Amazon Web Services. And this allows you to utilize a public cloud in simply a completely new way, because we're doing all of the same functionality that we have for the replication in the private cloud now into AWS. So you don't have to have an expensive DR target, and you can pay for your DR site on a monthly recurring basis. So what I'm now going to do is go into a bit of architecture in terms of how Zerto is deployed and managed in a private cloud, and then we'll also talk about Zerto in a public cloud space. So for a private cloud architecture, whether you're running VMware vSphere or Microsoft Hyper-V, it's the same Zerto components that we install. Just as on a technical note, the minimum vSphere version is 4.0 update 1 onwards, and the minimum Hyper-V version is Server 2012 R2. The first component that we install is our Zerto Virtual Manager, and this is our management interface for managing the orchestration, the automation, and the VM level integration. You install one of these per vCenter or system center, so you typically have one per data center. From the Zerto Virtual Manager, we then deploy our virtual replication appliances to each hypervisor host in a cluster that you're replicating from and to. There's absolutely no downtime and no impact to any existing virtual machines that are running on the hypervisor hosts as part of this VRA deployment. They're extremely small in their footprint, using 1 vCPU, 3 gigabytes of RAM, 12 gig of disk space, which means they're scalable because as the size of the environment grows, so does the number of replication appliances, and therefore the horsepower of this replication engine. The replication appliances are what allow the per VM level replication, and they have built-in compression of the replication traffic, typically 50% plus. You can throttle that replication traffic between working hours so that it doesn't saturate an entire link, and they also have built-in WAN resiliency, so if the link goes down, they don't store a huge backlog of change. They simply reference the metadata of the most recent changes, and when the link is restored, we take a copy of those changes, compress, replicate, insert them in the recovery site, and Zerto automatically self-heals. The final point in this architecture is the storage that you need in the target site. And for this, we recommend enough storage to cope with our journal, which is what allows point-in-time recovery. And this is only an additional 7 to 10% additional space, on average, on top of the replica VM. The reason I say on average is because, of course, you might have some virtual machines that use a little bit more and some that use a little bit less. But the important comparison here is that with traditional storage-based replication, you would need a snapshot reserve on both your production and DR site for the replication. With Zerto, you don't have to reserve any space in production. We don't write anything to the production site storage. And in the recovery site, our journal is just a thin VMDK on a per VM basis that will dynamically scale up and down depending on the data change rate. So if the data change rate is 100 gig week 1 and you've selected to keep 5 days of change, then the journal will be 100 gigabytes. If 2 weeks later that data change rate comes back down to 15 gigabytes, then we will actually reclaim that space back, and we won't have the wasted space that you would have with typical snapshot reserves. For our architecture replicating into AWS, the first thing that you need is a VPN connection to your VPC in AWS. This can actually be a direct connection as well, but we do need that underlying connectivity. The first thing that you install in production is just as you did in your private cloud architecture, is your Zerto Manager and your replication appliances. Again, no downtime for these. And then this is where it starts to go a little bit different. In AWS, in a large Windows EC2 instance, so M3 type large instance, we deploy our Zerto Cloud Appliance software in that Windows instance. And this is actually just a Zerto Virtual Manager for AWS. It gives you the same web-based DR management interface, so that if you were to lose your production site in this architecture diagram here, you would have the Zerto interface to log into to initiate and manage the recovery. For the replication, we're storing the replica VM in the journal in S3 storage, and we don't actually have any EC2 instances running until you click to failover, move, or test. And upon clicking a failover operation, we'll actually do an auto disk import of the S3 storage up into EBS disks and attach them and create the recovery EC2 instances. The obvious cost benefit of this is that you're only paying for the S3 storage, and the cost of running the Zerto Cloud Appliance, you don't have to pay for any running instances just sat there in case. So this means that the cost savings of replicating to AWS versus on-premise over a 3-year period can be extremely significant. We're talking 70% plus. If you were to go onto the AWS website yourself, go into their ROI calculator, you can put in your exact own figures and you will see the cost savings are absolutely huge. So if you look at your virtual environment today and all the different components that you need to build a complete BCDR solution, the first thing you need in 2015 is some enterprise-class virtual replication. Everything is now software-defined for speed, automation, and simplicity, and so you need something that's software-defined for replicating and protecting your virtual machines. Data loss has to be kept to a minimum, not only for a site-wide disaster, but logical failures such as a database corruption or a user error, and you need continuous data protection to recover to increments every few seconds. You will also need, for a complete solution, the ability to click to test, click to failover, and have the operation orchestrated and automated in minutes, because without this, you're going to have to do a manual recovery which can take many hours or days and not even work at all. The final component you need here is an offsite backup, and what I mean by this is a third copy of the data. Quite typically what we see customers do for a complete solution is they will have their replication, and then they will also have maybe a tape-based backup system to have a third copy of the data for, one, the ability to always recover, and two, for long-term retention of the data. And you can certainly go out there today and buy, install, and configure multiple different point solutions for everything that you see on the screen here. And you will have a complete solution, but the one thing that you wouldn't have is simplicity, because you're managing multiple point solutions. Zerto is the only solution in the world today that gives you all of the components that you see on the screen here in one simple to use software solution. And this is why we say it is simple and cost effective. And so what I'll do now is I'm going to take you through each of these feature benefits and exactly how we deliver them one by one, and we'll start with the enterprise class virtual replication. Feel free to ask any questions as I'm going along. I haven't seen any yet, but I am waiting. So for the enterprise class virtual replication, Zerto is replicating the changes continuously on a block level. So as we see a change in a protected virtual machine, the replication appliance takes a copy of that change, compresses, replicates, and inserts it in the recovery site in seconds. And this delivers a recovery point objective of just seconds, which minimizes your data loss and allows you to meet your SLAs. And this isn't just meeting SLAs for your Tier 1 applications, it's also meeting SLAs for your Tier 2 and Tier 3. Because, say for example, you have a Tier 2 application where you say, I only need to replicate this once a day. If you configure the replication once a day, and that's the SLA you define to the business, then you're always redlining your replication schedule versus your SLA. So you don't have the headroom or the leeway to cope with any large amounts of data change. With Zerto's RPO of seconds, if there is a huge amount of data change, then we will replicate that within minutes and give you the leeway and headroom that you need to always meet your SLAs and cope with that large amount of data change that you can have across any application at any point in time. I've certainly opened the floodgates here with the questions, so bear with me 1 second. So we have one question regarding our support for physical servers. Just to clarify, Zerto's support is strictly for virtual environments. For vSphere or Hyper-V environments, we cannot protect physical servers. We have a question here regarding Zerto's support for AWS and saying, if there are no running instances, how does Zerto handle applications such as AD that need real-time running machines to keep current? Good question. So Zerto doesn't handle that in terms of if you need Active Directory already running in AWS for a working recovery to happen, then quite simply make sure that you have an AD server already running in AWS paired to your local AD site. So in that circumstance, then most certainly then you are going to have to pay for an instance running for AD. But the one thing I will say is Active Directory doesn't typically use many resources, so you can certainly have one of the smaller AWS instance types to reduce that cost. We also have a question in terms of the failover to AWS. Does it have to be all the servers, or can it be a subselection? As you'll see in the demo, with Zerto operations, you can fail over individual protection groups. So depending on how you configure your protection groups, you can certainly fail over a subset of virtual machines and not the whole site. We have a question also around data migration, which we'll come on to later in the presentation. We have a specific point on that. And then the final question, because I certainly opened the floodgates here, is any plans for DR to Azure? And there most certainly are, but it's certainly not on our roadmap for this year, but maybe next year. So just to continue, for our replication, there's no performance impact because we're not using any form of snapshots, and that's exactly how we deliver this enterprise class protection, because we deliver the RPO of seconds, allowing you to meet your SLAs with no snapshots whatsoever. It's completely storage agnostic, allowing replication between any different type of storage array. It can be fiber channel in one site, iSCSI in another, or even local disk between any different vendor, which importantly removes lock-in, so you can mix and match your storage vendors on cost and SLA, not a technical limitation. And more importantly, in my opinion, it also removes the complexity because you're just selecting the VMs. It doesn't matter about the underlying data store configuration. It can be completely different between the sites. We have a question around data consistency, which let me take now. So how do you account for data in flight that fails to make it to the destination? That's a great question. So with our replication appliances, they are just replicating over a TCP network. If we see that the packet hasn't been received in the target site, then we just send it again. We also have a question around plugging in. So we do have a plugin to vCenter for System Center Virtual Machine Manager. That's purely managed from our web browser interface. We also have another question around the network. So I'm not quite sure on the exact question, but it's basically saying, how do you manage network traffic in applications? So from a Zerto perspective, we're just protecting virtual machines and allowing you to select the source and target networks and automatically change the IP addresses and MAC addresses or keep them the same. How the applications themselves actually behave, or what you do in terms of routing applications to, routing traffic to these virtual machines in DR scenario, is completely out of the context of Zerto. We're just replicating VMs and allowing you to map and change the network configurations. We have another question around the AWS instance. Yes, for running Zerto management in Amazon, it needs to be a Windows EC2 M3 large instance. And then for cross-hypervisor replication, when you click to protect the virtual machines, we create the VM in the target site disk format automatically. There's no conversion process. And then because we're just replicating blocks from one disk format and inserting them in another, it means that you don't have to wait for any lengthy conversion process, and we automatically convert the virtual machine's disks and settings as part of this failover process. Now, when Zerto 4.0 is released, included with the documentation is also our cross-hypervisor datasheet, which goes into specific detail on, this, for example, this virtual machine hardware version, this OS type, and this disk type will be mapped to this in Hyper-V, because as I'm sure you can appreciate, there are many different configurations between the hypervisors. We do have them all covered and documented, and you can change the default mappings on a per VM basis also. We just have a clarification around one of the questions, which was basically says, my data in flight question was around a production site failure. Since replication is asynchronous, there's no guarantee the copy in DR is recoverable because it doesn't appear to be application aware. It looks crash consistent only, which might be recoverable, might not. That is a great question and important point, and we will come on to application consistency very soon. Zerto, the continuous replication you see here, is crash consistent by default, but we do also have the ability to take application consistent points in time too, for that very reason. So in Zerto, we see our customers protecting enterprise applications such as CRM, ERP, SharePoint systems, and these are typically made up of multiple virtual machines with many virtual disks across different hosts and different storage. And in this example here, I have 3 applications, each consisting of 5 virtual protection groups, each consisting of 5 virtual machines. And in Zerto, we have the concept of a virtual protection group, which gives you complete application protection because you can simply add all of the VMs that form that application into a virtual protection group, and it gives you consistent multi-VM application recovery. We maintain the right order fidelity of these virtual machines, and we allow you to recover the entire application from just a few seconds ago in the past. If you compare Zerto to, for example, a free replication engine such as vSphere Replication or Hyper-V Replica, these have no concept of consistency groupings. They just replicate each VM to their own point in time. So if you take a multi-VM enterprise application with a free replication engine and I say what point in time can you recover to, the answer is I don't know because each VM is at a completely different timestamp. With Zerto, the answer is a few seconds ago on a per application basis. We have a quick question around the storage limitations of Zerto's journal to go back in time. So the journal is actually limited to 5 days in the past currently. If you want to retain the data longer than 5 days, then you can use our Offsite Backup feature, which I'll come on to later on. In terms of the storage limitation, the journals are just a virtual disk. So the limitation on the size of that journal is purely the size of the maximum supported disk for that target hypervisor and data store. This recovery point objective of seconds at a consistent point in time on a per protection group basis allows you to meet your SLAs, and we also allow you to prioritize the replication. Because if we take, for example, VPG 1, 2, and 3 that you can see here, the protection group 3 might not be as important as 1 and 2. You can put that as a low priority protection group, and if the bandwidth is available, we will maintain an RPO of seconds across the board. If the bandwidth becomes constrained, then we will let the recovery point objective of the third protection group increase while maintaining a low RPO on VPG 1 and 2. So this allows you to prioritize the replication traffic to ensure you're always meeting your application level SLAs, but utilizing the bandwidth available effectively. You can protect a virtual protection group across any number of hosts or storage devices within the same vCenter or system center. We allow you to precede the creation of this protection group to reduce the initial sync period, so we just send the changes. And once you've created this protection group, day-to-day changes that happen in your virtual environment, such as vMotion, live migration, SV motion between the hosts, there's no impact to Zerto. We just carry on replicating and protecting. You can also take, for example, if the comparison of Zerto with Veeam in this scenario, that Veeam, again, is just replicating virtual machines. It creates snapshots in the virtual machines. You can place them all in the same job, but it depends on how many VMs and how many VMs you have in each Veeam job, but they might not necessarily all be recovered to the same point in time. But the one thing you can say in comparing Zerto to Veeam is that Veeam is a fantastic solution for creating virtual machine backups. And I know this because I used it myself. And if you're scheduling a nightly backup of your VMs, gives you a nice local backup file you can do lots of different things with. Where the challenge comes with Veeam is when you're trying to do your backups and then you try and do replicas of the VMs on top, because they're both using snapshots. We all know that creating snapshots on VMs in working hours is a problem, and therefore you have a problem trying to manage your scheduling and your calendars between your backups and your replicas. So what we see a lot of customers do, and this is what I did myself, is I actually used Veeam for my local VM backups, and I had Zerto running on top. for my continuous data protection and my BCDR. And that way I was using the best solutions for the jobs that I needed doing, and you can run the two side by side with no conflict because Zerto isn't creating any form of snapshots, and Veeam can create its nightly snapshot for a backup and process it, remove it, and there's no impact in Zerto whatsoever. For our continuous data protection, Zerto gives you the ability to simply rewind to any point in time, down to the nearest second, up to 5 days in the past. And this means that we're giving you DVR-like functionality, which allows you to protect yourself not against just a site flooding or power loss or a hardware failure. We can protect you against logical failures such as a virus, a database corruption, or a faulty application upgrade, because you can simply rewind to a point in time from a few seconds ago, not the last backup or snapshot. So we're minimizing that data loss. We support application consistency, and we maintain the right order fidelity of all the VMs in this protection group, which allows you to recover your multi-VM applications all to the exact same point in time stamp that you can see here. You can see on the left-hand side, we did have a previous question about application consistency. We have support for Microsoft Windows with a VSS agent, where you can configure the schedule on which you want to take your application consistent points in time. The important thing here is, from a Zerto perspective, we just allow you to schedule when you insert the VSS point in time. How often you do that is completely up to you, and it's dependent on how often your application can cope with it being quiesced. From a Zerto point of view, you can see the checkpoints every few seconds. We could cope with a VSS point in time every 10 seconds, for example. Would any application in the wild actually support that? Probably not, which is why we allow you to schedule it. For disaster recovery automation, in the event of a disaster, you simply log into your recovery site Zerto Virtual Manager, which can be in your second data center, or it could be in AWS, for example. You click on the Live Failover button in the bottom right-hand corner. You select which protection groups you want to recover, and referring back to a previous question, so if you had, for example, 4 protection groups here, and you were replicating to AWS, and you only wanted to recover one, then you can just select that here. We give some advanced options around the recovery, such as our commit policy, which allows you to try a point in time. If that doesn't work, you can select a different point in time in the journal. So you can liken a commit policy to basically the time at which you want to delete the journal of change. We click Next, and in just those few clicks, we get a red Start Failover button. Once you click that, Zerto is going to automate the recovery process by automatically bringing the virtual machines online in the recovery site in just minutes with our automatic virtual machine recovery, where we'll do boot ordering to make sure that the virtual machines come online in the correct order. We can automatically change the IP and MAC addresses if you have a different subnet requirement for your DR site. And by the way, all of that is changeable on a per VNIC basis. You can run custom scripts, and I also mentioned the commit policy feature, allowing you to try different points in time. We have a couple of questions coming in. So can you have a virtual machine in more than one protection group, is the question. So not currently, no. So that you need to make some design considerations there. If, for example, you have one database VM that forms 2 applications, then we recommend placing them all in one virtual protection group. And so it is really just a design consideration in terms of recovery, the orchestration, and then the granularity of recovery that you need. We have a great question on DR testing, which is actually a great segue to the next point, in that we allow you to also click to test, where we'll bring the virtual machines online in an isolated bubble network with our non-disruptive failover testing. So we don't shut down the VMs in production. We don't break the replication. We just bring a copy of the VMs online. I say a copy, it's not actually a copy at all, because what we actually do is we create a scratch disk in the DR site, and any changes written in those test VMs are sent to the scratch disk, which is then deleted when you stop the test. So this is how we allow you to do the testing without breaking the replication. And because it's so easy to do this testing, it means we see people not just using this for DR, they use it day to day for example, for testing application upgrades. Because the first thing you probably all know is when you fill out a change request form, it says, have you tested this upgrade? And you think, oh, I have to go and restore a load of backups and try this, and it's a big pain. With Zerto, you can just click to test, have a copy of the VMs running online in minutes, and see if the application upgrade works. Stop the test, delete the change, go back to your change request form, and it's a very simple yes. We also have an offsite clone feature, which allows you to take full VMware or Hyper-V clones of the virtual machines from a specific point in time, which you can then use to build out long-term dev and test environments. And the offsite clone feature also works up in AWS. So you have a great use case of you can protect your applications to AWS and then use Zerto to build out all of your dev tests in AWS, removing it from production altogether. We have a great question on failback, which I'll come on to in 2 points' time. The next thing to note is in terms of migration, Zerto has a migrate button which shuts down the virtual machines in production, replicates the last few I/O of change, and brings them online in the recovery site in just minutes. So everything that makes Zerto great for DR also makes it great for migrations, because you just have your replica data seconds of lag behind. You can test the move before you actually move, and we automate the migration process, giving you a migration time objective of just minutes. And a great use case here is if, for example, you bought Zerto today to replicate between your VMware environments, the one thing for most customers that we talk to, they definitely can't say is that in 2-3 years' time, you might still be using VMware. You might have to consider switching to Hyper-V due to licensing costs. We actually have some customers who had some big issues with licensing, and they were specifically told to resolve them, you actually have to switch to Hyper-V. So the great thing from a Zerto perspective is you can use the exact same license to first migrate over to Hyper-V, do the isolated bubble network test to verify the conversion process and check the performance of the VMs now running in the new hypervisor, and then reutilize the exact same license to then re-protect the virtual machine between your Hyper-V environments. Then the final point here is in terms of failback, it's simply a single checkbox where we automatically reverse the replication and start replicating the changes back to the production site. It's just the changes. You don't have to recreate all the protection groups, and it's just a single checkbox. One point here in terms of failback from Amazon, it is currently not included in the Zerto software. It is a manual V2V export process, so you'd simply just install VMware Converter, create copies of the virtual machines to send them back into the production site. The reason why it's currently a V2V export process is because, as you can see, Zerto replicates using replication appliances. There is no hypervisor on which to install a replication appliance running in AWS, but we do have on our roadmap for the end of 2015 the ability to click to automate this failback process, so it will be included as part of the software and upgraded in place for any customers who were to buy Zerto today. We have a question around the migration button to AWS. Yes, you can click to move into AWS within seconds also. We have a question also on the number of VMs in a protection group. There is no limit on the number of VMs in a protection group. However, we rarely see anybody go above 90 just due to the granularity of the recovery. We have a question on, can you comment on the difference between Zerto and Site Recovery Manager? So yes, I certainly can. In terms of Zerto replaces all of the functionality in Site Recovery Manager and all of the replication that you would configure either using vSphere replication or your storage-based replication. So you can liken it to Site Recovery Manager, but 10 times more simple, installable in minutes, and the flexibility of our per VM replication with no snapshots, the journal-based protection giving you recovery to increments every few seconds, and not only being storage agnostic, but hypervisor agnostic too. The one thing you can say about SRM is it's only ever going to work in a VMware environment. If in 2-3 years' time you decide you need to utilize some Hyper-V in your infrastructure or switch altogether, any investment you make in SRM is going to be lost. That's now not the case with Zerto 4.0. I think we also have an ask for a comparison with Veeam. I pretty much covered that already, I believe, in terms of Veeam is very much focused towards backup, and there's also an inherent problem when you're trying to manage the schedules between backups and replication jobs in Veeam when you're continuously using snapshots. So with Zerto, because we don't use snapshots and it's continuous replication, you can use Veeam for the local backups and Zerto for the replication on top, giving you all the features that we've covered so far today. A new exciting feature that we have, and this has actually been in the product since 3.5, but we're starting to push it more and more as we add more features to it, and it's our offsite backup capability. And what this does is it gives you a third copy using the replicated data of the virtual protection group in a backup on a daily, weekly, or monthly schedule. And this means that you have a portable compressed file that you can recover to any vCenter, System Center, or Zerto manager, which protects you against the BCDR site failure. So if you have a problem with your target storage that you have all the replica data on, this third copy is just a compressed backup file which you can take to any different storage device. It could be SMB, share, a disk to the Zerto manager, a dedicated deduplication device, or you could even store it up in AWS S3 and have that life cycle down into Glacier. And the important thing is it means that you can always recover, because even if you have a problem with your BCDR site, your storage, your replica data, you always have that third copy of the data to ensure you can always recover. Because it's taken from the replicated data in your BCDR site, you don't have to manage any windows for the backups in the in the production site. We do have a question around deduplication. So our backup is compressed. We typically see a 50% plus compression ratio, and you can store that on deduplicated storage. It could just be Windows Server 2012 deduplication. In combination with our compression, we typically see a 95% compression in dedupe rate, which is pretty astounding. It can be a dedicated dedupe device, or it could just be straight into Amazon S3. And the other exciting benefit of this offsite backup is not just the ability to always recover, is that you can keep this offsite backup indefinitely, which means you can use it to extend your protection beyond the journal. We had a question earlier saying, can I extend the protection up to 30 days? Yes, you can with this offsite backup feature. And you can keep the data forever, which means you can use this for long-term data retention also. If you take this in the context of AWS S3 and Glacier, it means that rather than taking tape backups, having the tape shipped off-site, you can now just have them lifecycle tiered into Glacier storage for pretty much the cheapest storage possible. In terms of simplicity, Zerto is managed from the single interface that you can see here, that they're actually the same interface irrespective of the underlying hypervisor being VMware, Hyper-V, or AWS, giving you consistent management and control across your hypervisors. It's simple to manage because you're just selecting the virtual machines that you want to replicate and protect, because it's hypervisor integrated, and it gives you real-time replication data, KPIs, SLAs, alerts, and reports, delivering an enterprise-class BCDR control plane, because you can always see what is happening with your replication in your environment and which are the busiest VMs, busiest protection groups, as well as all of the orchestration and automation capabilities. And if you have multiple Zerto managers, multiple sites, we also have a manager of managers, which is a separate installable piece of software, not shown here, but it does allow you to manage many Zerto managers from one interface, where you can also configure our VCD integration, multi-tenancy, and self-service. In terms of, we have a question here for encryption of the backup. So it is on our roadmap later in the year to integrate with third-party encryption software or keys, for example. But at the minute, we don't encrypt the backup ourselves. But if you wanted to place it on encrypted storage and have a separate management service for that, you certainly can. We also have a question around reporting. So from a Zerto perspective, we integrate in terms of reporting with vCenter. So all of our alerts and alarms are triggered within vCenter. We have our own reporting dashboards within the software, and we have a full REST API for any of our large enterprise customers and cloud providers that want to build their own reports too. So if we look at an environment before Zerto and all the different solutions that you would need to have a complete BCDR solution, the first thing you would need is some storage-based replication typically, replicating between your storage arrays. Then you would probably have something for recovery automation such as SRM. You would have a third solution for continuous data protection and the ability to go back to increments every few seconds. And then finally, you'd have an offsite backup solution for that third copy of the data to ensure you can always recover. If we take this exact same environment and install Zerto with one software solution, you have all of the automation, the replication, the CDP, and the third copy with the offsite backup, giving you the simplicity and the ease of use of just using the single piece of software. If we look at the case studies that we have available of customers using Zerto today, we have customers all over the world from financial, healthcare, commercial, industrial, and education spaces where these are all available on the website, where you can go and see exactly why each of these, and often big names and sometimes even small companies, are using Zerto today. Because the one thing I can say is we have customers with 10 or 15 virtual machines up to huge customers with thousands of virtual machines. And the reason that we protect all of them is because they all have the same challenge, which is simply protecting VMs running in a hypervisor. So what I'd now like to do for the last 10 minutes of the webinar is switch across to a demo. So any questions, just as I'm logging in, feel free to put them in the chat window and we'll answer them as we go along. I might just have to log back in if you bear with me. So for those of you interested, this is actually Zerto 4.0 release candidate 1, and I actually have this plugged into my VMware vSphere 6 data center, which I can show you behind here. Just bear with me 1 second. Come to the virtual machine view. So you can see on the left-hand side, I have my virtual replication appliances, some Zerto managers, and a huge group of virtual machines that I'm replicating and protecting. If we come across to my Zerto manager interface here, here is the KPI dashboard that you can see, where we can see the protection group health. We can see the total number of protection groups that we have protected, the number of VMs that make up those protection groups, the total data protected in the protection group, so 1 terabyte, an average recovery point objective of 6 seconds across the board, and the real-time compression of any changes occurring, which we can see is currently at 97%. If we click on the Virtual Protection Group tab, here we can see on a per protection group basis, you can see the real-time replication of just seconds, showing data loss of just seconds on a per protection group basis. And you can see here, if you look at the names on the left-hand side, and apologies if the text is a little small, that I actually have protection groups going from VMware to VMware, VMware to Hyper-V, and VMware to AWS, all from the same production data center. I can see the same KPIs on a per virtual machine basis, and we also have the ability to select the performance tab here, where you can see which are the busiest VMs in terms of the I/O, throughput, network, storage, and use storage. We have a question around supported applications, specifically Meditech and certification of the DR technology. So we do have many customers protecting Zerto, so protecting health applications with Zerto. And the one point of thing from a certification point of view is that Zerto is not doing anything in the guest of the VM in terms of protecting that application, because we're just doing block level replication. So from a certification point of view, Zerto is just the same as a storage-based replication solution because it's an exact copy of the data in the recovery site at the block level. So we don't have any specific certifications for individual applications because it's just storage-based replication from their point of view. And when you click to recover, we maintain the write order fidelity and also give you the ability to recover from an application point, consistent point in time. One thing to clarify here, if we come across to the Sites tab, is that you can have multiple Zerto managers paired together, whether it's Hyper-V, AWS, or VMware, but the only caveat is you can only send one virtual protection group to one target site. You can't have a VM running in VMware replicating to AWS and VMware simultaneously. If we come across to the Setup tab, from the VRAs here, this is where we deploy and manage our virtual replication appliances onto each hypervisor host. The new VRA button is currently grayed out because I've deployed a VRA to each host, but just to show you the configuration screen, you simply set the root password for the host, give the replication an IP address. You can also select a port group and data store when you're deploying it. You click deploy and the OVF appliance is deployed in minutes, no downtime required, no reboot of the ESXi host, no impact to any existing virtual machines running. You can also configure the repositories to use for the third copy of the data and the offsite backup, which is just done from this screen here, where you can see you can select a local disk or an SMB share. And then typically once you've configured the replication appliances and your repositories, the next step is to configure which virtual machines you actually want to replicate and protect. And this is done using our create VPG workflow that you see here. The first thing you can select is the priority, which as I mentioned is the built-in QoS. So if the bandwidth becomes constrained, we'll apply the QoS set here. You then select the VMs that you want to replicate and protect, and this is just a list of all of the VMs in the source vCenter. And all the VMs that I put in this protection group are all recovered to the exact same point in time with the ability to define the boot ordering to ensure, for example, the database VM comes online first. And this is where it gets really cool in Zerto 4.0 because for the recovery site, I can select any target Zerto manager paired with this VMware site. So I can select AWS, Hyper-V, or VMware. From a Zerto point of view, it really doesn't matter anymore because it's completely hypervisor agnostic. We have a question around where do you set the retention for the third copy. I can show you that exactly because if you look along the create VPG workflow, there is a backup tab, so we will come on to that. So in this example here, I'm going to select AWS as my target hypervisor, and you can see I have the ability to select the default journal history, a target RPO alert, which is just an alarm. The journal history is the time frame in which to keep changes for to go back in time, and then the test reminder is just an alarm. If the protection group hasn't been tested in that time frame, it will send an email. In terms of the recovery type, then we can configure the mappings of the virtual NICs to the VPC networks, subnets, and security groups that we have available in the region where my Zerto cloud appliance is installed. You can select multiple security groups if required, and we also have the ability to specify scripts as part of the failover process. We have a question around how many appliances are required when replicating to multiple hypervisors. So it's a good question, but if we go back to the architecture, it's one replication appliance per hypervisor host. And that's only hypervisor hosts that you're replicating from and to. So if you had 5 in VMware and 5 in Hyper-V, they're all in the same cluster, then you would need 10 replication appliances. So as you vMotion or live migrate VMs, we can continue the protection. On the backup tab here, this is where you configure the schedule and the retention history for your third copy of the data, where you can select the target repository. I don't have one configured up in AWS. You can select the retention period, the frequency on which to run, the automatic retry, and any post-backup scripts. And the reason it's configured here is because Zerto takes the offsite backup using the replicated data, then you have to have the VMs replicated in the first place. Therefore, that's why we do it as part of this workflow in creating a virtual protection group. If I was to click Next and then Done, Zerto would perform an initial sync of the VMs in the background with no snapshot, and when that's finished, it then gets into the continuous data protection state, which you see here with my RPO of seconds on a per application basis. What we typically see customers do next is then a test failover to verify that the recovery is successful, check how long it takes, and in the circumstance of going cross-hypervisor from VMware to Hyper-V, vice versa, or into AWS, check the conversion process and any manual steps that you might need to take. So here you can see I have the ability to do a test failover to AWS, to VMware, and also VMware to VMware. So in this example here, I'll do my CRM application to VMware and also Hyper-V. For the failover to AWS, because it is an EBS disk import, the process is reliant on Amazon taking the disks from the S3 storage, creating them on EBS and attaching them to S3. So the typical RTO for AWS is around 30 to 60 minutes, depending on that import process. If you demand a better SLA in terms of your recovery time objective, then we recommend using Zerto to replicate to your VMware or Hyper-V on-premise data centers, or even better is replication to a Zerto cloud service provider, because they also give you the benefit that you have in AWS of not having to have your own DR site altogether anyway. If we click Next, you can see we have the checkpoint field, which gives you the ability to select the previous points in time to failover or test failover to, and we have the increments every few seconds. And then if we click Next and start failover test, what we will see is Zerto automatically building our failover test environment in our target vCenter, so from vCenter to vCenter, and from vCenter into the system center in Hyper-V. So I'll switch across to the correct view here, 1 second. So what you can now see on the inventory on the left-hand side, we have the CRM-app1 file-testing recovery virtual machines being created. So this is going to power them on in a second in the correct order and allow us to log into the console and check this recovery works. And if I come across to my Hyper-V host, I will have to sign back in as it's on a timeout. So I'll just log in here. We will load our Hyper-V manager in a moment. I definitely think this rebooted overnight due to a Windows update, because this was on last time I loaded it. So here you can see, using my Hyper-V manager, we have Zerto currently building the failover test from VMware to Hyper-V. So we have the free testing recovery VMs. And if we log into the System Center Virtual Machine Manager, we can see the operation running from there too. So one important thing just to show you that you can see Zerto is building these two failover tests. And if we click, for example, on the CRM-app2 virtual protection group, we're building the failover test, yet we can still see the RPO of seconds in the top left corner. And if we come across to the vSphere web client, if we look on the inventory on the left-hand side, we still have the CRM-app1 database file web servers and the two equivalent all running in VMware in production with no shutdown. So this is the ability to do the DR testing in working hours without any shutdown in production or break in the replication. We have a question around, although the RPO is seconds, what is the typical RTO for a virtual machine? Is it dependent on the hypervisor? Yes, it certainly is. So I can tell you the typical RTO for a VM running to VMware or Hyper-V is typically a few minutes, but it totally depends on, first of all, how many VMs you're failing over, and then second, how many VMs you can fail over to that target host or hypervisor without incurring a boot or process storm. So it is actually configurable as an advanced setting in Zerto where you can say, I want to fail over 10 VMs every host every 5 minutes, or you could tweak that up to 20 or down to 5. It's completely up to you. So the recovery time objective from a Zerto point of view is as fast as your infrastructure will allow us to run. There's a question around hooks where we can let Zerto know applications have been quersed. Yes, there certainly is. So we have our REST API where you can hook into that and you can easily insert a checkpoint to say, I have now quersed my application and this is now a consistent point in time in your journal stream. So yes, that's certainly possible. So we can see if we come across back to the Virtual Protection Group tab, my CRM application test failover is now completed. So we have the virtual machines in the inventory to log into. The test failover is still completing to Hyper-V. So we can refresh my vSphere web client. And in the top left corner, you can now see the free testing recovery VMs have now been powered on. The reason you can see the test recovery VMs in the same vCenter as production is because this is vSphere 6. I have a single sign-on domain where I have both vCenters managed by the same web client. If it was a disaster, I could very easily log into the IP on the opposite vCenter server as well. Now we are just about to run out of time. In fact, we probably have. So I won't complete logging into the virtual machines themselves, but just to show you, you can click to stop the test. We ask for the result. You can add in some notes. This can all be done programmatically as well using PowerShell or the API. You click stop. We automatically clean up the failover test, and you can produce a PDF report detailing the outcome of this disaster recovery testing, which you can then use to build reports for senior management, auditors, and your board, for example. And just to show you what that looks like, here we have an example recovery report where you can see on a per protection group basis when it was tested, who did it, what the outcome was, the recovery site settings, and then the detailed recovery steps undertaken by Zerto. So we have definitely run out of time now, but if anyone wants to hang around for the next few minutes and ask any questions, please feel free to do so, and I'll take them one by one. We have a question regarding the recording of the demo. So it is processed after and then shared back out, so you will be able to share this with any colleagues in your organization. We have a question on how is Zerto licensed. It's licensed per protected virtual machine. And as I mentioned, these virtual machine licenses are transferable between VMware and Hyper-V. Next question is, while the systems are being built in the DR location, do active changes from production get replayed up until they are powered on? So they're replayed in terms of they are in the recovery site, but they are not replayed into the DR test VM itself. As soon as you click the failover test operation, you've selected a checkpoint. That point in time is what is used for that failover test. No new data can get in there from the replication traffic. We have a question, where can I find the price per VM? What I recommend for that is contact your preferred reseller, ask for some Zerto pricing. They'll typically ask for the number of protected virtual machines. It's a minimum of 15 for our base package, and we'll be able to get you some pricing very easily. And is there an enterprise license? Good question in terms of Zerto's licensing scheme. It's just one VM license and that's it. There's no different tiers of that license, so with the per VM license you get all of the features that I've covered here today. Is there a demo license available? Yes, there certainly is. Just go to Zerto.com now, click to get a trial. You can download it, install it, and have it up and running in minutes. My own record is around 9 minutes for getting 2 ZVMs deployed, paired, and 2 replication appliances. And that isn't in the fastest of labs, so I'm pretty sure that you can beat that out in a real production environment, that's for sure. Just to confirm, you said we needed 1 Zerto appliance on each VM host, is that correct? And the appliance was virtual and or physical. Just to confirm, it's 1 replication appliance per VM host, yes, and it is purely virtual. There's no physical appliances whatsoever. I'll hang on for another couple of minutes as I wait for a few more questions. So I haven't seen any new questions for at least a minute so far, so if anybody does think of any questions going forward, my email address is joshua@zerto.com. Feel free to give me a shout. Thanks everyone for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.